talking about repentance, let's make sure that we have a clear understanding of consequence. Now, we've recognized that consequence and punishment are not synonymous. But when we look at consequence, we need to understand that consequence is inevitable. Consequence is always the reaction or the result of a particular action or decision. That's always consequence. Now, whether we relate that consequence to positive or negative is when we turn that consequence into either punishment or reward. So we talked about the consequence and the consequence of sin, that all of us are born into sin, and sin, the result or the consequence of sin, is the separation of us from the presence of God. And that separation of us from the presence of God is recognized as hell. But let's zero in a little bit more on consequence, where we recognize that we are forgiven. So God does not send anyone to hell, but he did send his son to save us from hell. So let's dig back into consequence, all right? There's two types of consequences, generally speaking. There is what I call the eternal consequence, which is that consequence of the afterlife, of either being in heaven or hell. And then there is the temporal consequence. And the temporal consequence is what we go through right now. Now, I've taught you before that our bodies are built as forgiveness machines. So there are certain consequences that our bodies experience, and the body healing or forgiving that particular offense to it sometimes is a reward, and sometimes is, we could say, a punishment. Sometimes it's negative, sometimes it's positive. Let me give you an example. I always go back to weightlifting. If you go and you lift weights, you are offending your muscles. You're actually tearing them. You're putting a strain on those muscles that is causing damage to them. But your body, the forgiveness machine, heals. And the way that your body heals is by making those muscles stronger. So the result or the consequence of the weightlifting, the consequence of that offense is actually a reward, or at least we see it as a reward, okay? And we see it as a reward because we've got bigger, stronger, longer lasting muscles. So that's how we see it as a reward. Now, at the same token, if you are, handling a sharp object, and you drop this sharp object, or you mishandle this particular sharp object, and it breaks your skin, it cuts you, okay? Well, your body, again, the forgiving body that it is going to heal that particular cut. And it's going to end up leaving a scar or a wound. And this mark that is left is a remembrance of the offense that was caused to your body. But your body, the forgiveness machine that it is, will still heal that broken skin, fill in that space, and you're ready to operate again with a slight blemish, with a slight mark. So both lifting weights and dropping a sharp object cause offenses to the body. And consistently, the body will heal past those offenses. In one scenario, that healing is a reward. In another scenario, that blemish could be looked at as a punishment or as a scar. Either way it goes, it's how you receive that consequence that makes it a reward or a punishment. Now, sometimes we can trick our minds. We can make certain things that are truly critical or negative, we can begin to embrace them and enjoy them as a positive. Like when you offend your body with the consumption of alcohol. Consuming alcohol, not only does it kill brain cells, but it also thwarts your conscious sobriety or your decision-making ability. So you've impeded upon your body or your mind's ability to make decisions with this choice of consuming the alcohol. Now, some of us have embraced that, And we look forward to that drunken feeling, to that drunken state, to that intoxicated state. We look forward to that. And so since we look forward to it, we've embraced that, and it's no longer a negative consequence, but it becomes a rewarding consequence to some degree. It doesn't quite calculate. It doesn't quite make sense how being inebriated, having your decision-making ability could be a reward, except for with that loss of decision-making ability, you also end up losing certain stresses and certain pains, certain thoughts that don't cross your mind. And unfortunately, that's where people fall in and get addicted to that feeling of relief. But the problem is, once that feeling of relief wears off, the reality of what you've been avoiding is still there. And it hits even heavier now because you've had a taste of life without it. And so when it sets back in, its weight is magnified and you feel it even worse than you would have felt it just going through it soberly. So we look at consequence and we look at reward. We look at reward and punishment both as two different outputs of consequence. And we're getting the foundation laid so that we can deal with repentance. But that's another discussion for another drive. I'll see you soon.